All right, guys. Thank you for coming to this panel. I'm so excited to get this started. Oh, thank you, Hayden. Yeah, I know I'm on mute.
Okay.
Yeah. So the rest of my co-hosts are on their way. Jamila Shanti is right here. Mateo is in the call as well, and Shauna is on her way, I believe. So just to get started with everything, first of all, thank you guys for joining us, and choosing like this specifically to be at. Again, as you guys can see, this is a Zoom call, so it's not a Zoom webinar. So this is going to be like very, very discussion based. I want to hear from you guys and your experiences, and the questions that you guys really have. So we have a lot of exciting things for you guys today. We have a whole presentation ready for you for this. We worked really hard on this presentation, and we just want to give you guys the best experience possible, and have you guys learn, because that's what you guys are here to do. So do you want to introduce ourselves? So my name is Julian Hector. I am the LGBT Caucus chair. My pronouns are he, him. And I would ask you guys, if you guys can, to rename yourselves, and put your pronouns, just to be as inclusive as possible, in your name, like I did just now. Can you guys rename yourselves?
Hi, everyone. I am Mateo Serna. I am the vice chair of the Black Caucus, and I'm really excited to be joined by everyone and present this to you.
So to rename yourselves, just go to the three dots, and then you should see rename. Or you go to participants. Yep, thank you, Grace.
Wait, where do you go?
Go to participants, and then you should and click on more, and you should be able to rename yourself. Okay, guys.
Oh, okay, I see it.
Wait, where are the three dots? I'm
No,
in.
Go to participants.
Yeah.
More. Like a more thing.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There you go.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you. So I'm gonna share the presentation with you guys right now, and we're gonna get started. And again, if you have anything, feel free to unmute yourself and just talk whenever you want. Really. No raising your hands, none of that. And feel free to use the chat as well if you have any questions or if you want to ask a question or anything. Okay. All right, can you guys all see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. So welcome to Summit 2020. This is the Black Caucus and LGBT Caucus seminar on intersectionality within our two communities. Yay! So we're first going to start off, we introduced ourselves already, with our speaker. So we have a guest speaker here today to talk about the LGBT.
Wait, Jordan. I'm sorry, Julian.
You're good.
We didn't all introduce ourselves yet.
Oh, okay. Introduce yourself then if you didn't.
Okay. Hi, my name is Jamila Ashanti Scales. I am the chair of the Black Caucus, and I'm glad to be here with you all today. Shauna?
Yeah, I'm Shauna Richards. I am, I use she, her pronouns. I am the vice chair of the LGBTQ plus caucus.
Hi, everyone. I'm Mateo Serna. I am the vice chair of the Black Caucus, and I'm really excited to be presenting this to you today.
Yeah, so we're gonna move on to our speaker. Jamila, do you want to introduce Jordan?
Yes. Our speaker today is Jordan Thompson. He's from Nashville, New Hampshire. He's an activist and a community organizer. I look up to him so much, and he's just done so much for our community, and I'm so happy to have him here with us today. Jordan, if you'd like to introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with all of you today. My name is Jordan Thompson, and I am the racial justice organizer for the American Civil Liberties Union of New Hampshire. I am the founder and director of Black Lives Matter Nashua. And as this wonderful graphic that y'all put together sort of paints out, I've been involved in other various entities and community organizations. I am just super, super appreciative of this opportunity. I'm really grateful to Jamila Ashanti for allowing me the space and for all of the work that she's done over the past several years working on racial justice and stepping up to become a leader in the state of New Hampshire. I want to see if, I'm not sure if y'all can see me. Zoom problems. Let's see. Okay.
Yay.
Can you see me now?
You know, yep.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, so awesome. Thank you. Past month has been very, very, very interesting in the sense that there are so many things that are coming together in a short period of time, and there are so many issues that we're trying to raise awareness about in this short period of time. Can I just ask that it appears that someone does not have their mic muted? Can we get that taken care of? Thank you. Yeah, as I was saying, we have a lot of things that we've been focusing on both the ACLU of New Hampshire and Black Lives Matter Nashua. But right now, we're at a time where we are trying to captivate the attention of people who are just starting to listen and speak up for the first time in their lives on the issue of racial justice. And that is a very large task. We have seen over the past month, thousands of new people show up to protests, show up to vigils, show up to events. They've started to really think and do the work of anti-racism in a way that they had never considered before. And we're incredibly appreciative of that, but we are also actively looking for ways to continue to engage that demographic, to continue to engage that audience. Just Saturday, we had a protest and rally in Concord, New Hampshire at the New Hampshire State House. And we had an attendance of around 800 people, but we noticed that that was a smaller attendance than some of the protests that we've been having over the past couple of weeks. And we realized that we are in total danger of something that has happened before happening again. We were around in 2015 and 2016 to see the national movement behind Black Lives Matter and to see the outrage after Sandra Bland was killed, after Philando Castile was killed. And we saw the protests, we saw the social media posts, and we saw how people were engaged. And then we saw how that fizzled out. We were still doing the organizing in our communities. We were still showing up on these issues, but WMUR no longer covered it. The media moved on to different stories along the election. And this narrative was hijacked from us. Black Lives Matter became less about Black Lives Matter and the acknowledgement of that, and more about narratives that right-wingers or people from other political parties have decided to attach to us. And I worked on Kamala Harris's campaign as an organizer. One thing that she used to always say was, growing up, her mother always told her that she should never let anyone tell her who she is, that she should tell them who she is. And so that's what we have to do in this moment. We have to not let any of the people who are interested in hijacking our narrative and hijacking the direction of our movement tell us who they think we are. We have to tell them very clearly that we are here in a movement, and it's not a moment. It's not one singular moment that you can post about on your Instagram story or, tweet or post on Facebook and then decide in a few weeks that you no longer care about it. That's what we've seen in the past, and what's different this time, because it's important to acknowledge that this time feels very different. What's different this time is that young people are at the forefront of this movement, that they are the ones organizing the events, they are organizing the protests, they are making sure that folks are standing up and speaking out, and that's incredibly crucial. So I thank all of you so much for your hard work with the high school Dems in every state and every community across the United States. And we have to keep this movement going, and we can do that by challenging ourselves, the white allies non-Black allies on this call. We can continue that movement by challenging our family members. I always like to talk about the racist uncle at Thanksgiving dinner who we sort of just allow and enable to have those abhorrent opinions and don't say anything to correct them because we don't want to start anything. But this moment requires people to stand up and speak out. It requires that we hold our elected officials accountable. Whether you're a Democrat or Republican or a member of another political party, you are not absolved of accountability on the issue of racial justice. And at Black Lives Matter Nashua, in coordination with the other chapter here in New Hampshire, Black Lives Matter Manchester, we put out a set of demands that are aimed at the gubernatorial candidates that are running for governor here in New Hampshire. And we've gotten several responses now from different candidates. We're still waiting on a response from our governor, Chris Sununu, but it's very easy for elected officials to go on Twitter right now and tweet, I just met with a member of Black Lives Matter and I'm so appreciative of all of their efforts. And it's not so easy to say, not only do I stand with Black Lives Matter in solidarity, but I'm also going to act on the policy demands that they have set forth. And so we want both. We want both of those things. We don't just want one, we want both. So it absolutely is on us to hold these elected officials accountable, to call them out when they need to be called out, to not be concerned or worried about the optics of the situation when we are on the right side of history. We are standing for justice, and that's important to acknowledge and remember at all time. I would also say that it's about reminding them that at the end of the day, they are beholden to us because we are their constituents and we have the power to vote them out of office. And if you find that you have an elected official who cares more about lip service and performative solidarity than actual justice, then you should run to unseat them. And that's what I did. In 2018, I'm sorry, my years are blending together, but in 2018, I ran for the New Hampshire House of Representatives, and I was the youngest person in the race by 40 years, and we had much more established, well-established individuals who were members of the community, but I had been involved within the Democratic Party in my community, and I was tired of hearing from older folks that, why aren't young people more involved? Why aren't they paying attention to these issues? Why aren't they showing up for their community? And I was, and they told me to sit down and wait my turn. They told me that I wasn't ready to run or to serve. And I lost my primary, but I lost it by 30 votes. I demonstrated that there was a need, there was a desire within the community for youth representation. And so I say full on, if you see a representative that does not represent you, then you should run to unseat them 100%. So it's about making sure that this is not just a moment, that this is a movement, that we are continuing to have young people lead this effort in all of our efforts because we are the next generation. We are the change that we want to see in our communities. It's about continuing to stand up and speak out and challenging your friends and family. And when you're in high school, you're in a class and you hear that guy who's making a racist joke and you know within your heart that it's not right for him to say, and maybe his friends laugh at it, but that's your opportunity to speak up and speak out and say, that's not what we're about here. That's not okay. That means everything. That means everything to the Black folks and even other people who are targeted. Of course, this is about intersectionality, and I'm a proud Black queer person. So I understand this difficult dynamic in a way that others may not. And I've heard the gay jokes, I've heard the bi jokes, I've heard the Black jokes, and none of them are funny. But I've also stood by and seen how my non-Black or non-LGBTQ plus friends, or people who I called my friends, listened to these things and they heard the microaggressions and they might have said to me later on, Jordan, that was messed up, but they didn't speak up in the moment. And so that's what we need. We need people to take personal responsibility and hold each other accountable, to make sure that we are extending that same accountability to members of our family, members of our community, to show up as allies, not just on social media, but in real life as well. Because frankly, we don't just want to read or see Black Lives Matter from you on a social media post. We want you to actually act on that belief that Black Lives Matter in every area of your personal life, because that's where it really matters. So we have to continue doing those things, to have those difficult conversations. We have to continue to say their names, to say the names of people like Breonna Taylor, who still does not have justice, like Ahmaud Arbery, like George Floyd, like Sandra Bland, like so many others who do not have the justice that they deserve, whose families are still begging for the bare minimum of justice. We are still waiting on the arrest of the officers that killed Breonna Taylor. We should have that. And the reason that we do not is because elected officials feel so comfortable that they do not have to answer to the general public. And we have the power to change that. we have the power to say to them, no, we deserve answers and we deserve justice. So I will also say, on a side note, that there is a very specific reason why young people are standing up and reacting in a different way than our parents. And it's because we are the children of people who talked about Rodney King. We grew up watching the Ferguson riots. We watched as Trayvon Martin was killed and George Zimmerman walked free. We watched as our first Black president was elected and he was subjected to obstruction and racism and white supremacy structures his entire presidency. We have seen up close and personal that these systems do not work. We can no longer be in the business of incrementalism because we have seen firsthand that incrementalism does not work. And so we need bold systemic change in this moment to make sure that our future is one that we can truly be proud of, that we're not trying to make something out to be that it was not, that we are not sugarcoating our history, that we are not sugarcoating this moment, that we are being honest and open and delivering constructive feedback in all of these forms. So I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I am so incredibly thankful again for this opportunity. If you are interested in keeping up with the work of Black Lives Matter Nashua, I ask that you follow us on Instagram, BLM Nashua, Twitter, Facebook, the same thing. We're at blmnashua.com. You're able to donate and to look at links to the media that we've been doing. We're so tired. We've been doing so much work over the past month, but I will say as sort of a final note that this is very difficult work. This is very hard work. And, you know, we just organized this rally on Saturday in Concord, and it was maybe the 20th or 21st rally that we've organized or been a part of in the last 3 to 4 weeks. And so it is a constant demand. We constantly have people who are writing to us, everyone from Governor Sununu all the way down, who are asking us to be their racial justice organizers free of charge. And that is my full-time job, but it has become even more than a full-time job. We have, on the flip side, people who are engaged in some bad faith attacks. When we say defund the police, they want to make it seem like we want to get rid of all police, when we're out there fighting for the basic necessities to say that we should divest from law enforcement agencies and say that, well, it's not fair that you have access to military grade weaponry and you're able to fire tear gas and rubber bullets into crowds of peaceful demonstrators, but my book in school still says that Bill Clinton is president. My education system is crumbling. My infrastructure is crumbling. Public health and housing is crumbling, but somehow we are still able to allocate all of this money to law enforcement agencies for them to serve, protect, and defend our communities, and they're not really doing that. So there are a lot of bad actors. There are folks who show up to our events in full armed militia gear. We have people who are calling us terrorists every single day. I've got to stop reading what people say about me, but it's difficult. You know, every single day we have someone who's threatening our lives, who's threatening to shoot us. And we are doing this work because our lives are on the line. This is an issue of life and death, but because we want to see a future that we can be proud of, where we no longer have to say Black Lives Matter. We want to see a future where we know that Black Lives Matter, and that's reflected in policy, that's reflected in legislation, it's reflected in every area that is currently being strangled by systemic racism and white supremacy in the United States. So I, again, appreciate this so much. Thank you so much for having me. As I said, you can follow us online. We're at blmnashua.com. And if you have any questions, if you have any comments, feel free to reach out to me. Jamila Ashanti is my contact info. We're very busy these days, so I'll try my best to get back at a reasonable manner. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jordan, for talking about your experiences and sharing, you know, your message. Because I think it's so important to hear this from people who look like me and from people who come from an intersectional approach and who are fighting on the ground. So next up, we're gonna have a quick. If you guys have any questions for Jordan, if you guys have 1 or 2 questions, you guys can ask it now for a quick Q&A session for him. You guys just feel free to just unmute yourself if you have a question.
I'm Gabriel. My pronouns are he, him. Just a quick question. As far as, organizing and spreading news with all these social justice issues, how can we in a community that often, has these really radical ideals, either left wing or right wing, how can we create, a sense of unity? How are you able to do that?
That's a really great question. I would say right now it's difficult because we do have different social justice oriented organizations that are seemingly working through the same channels to achieve the same goals, but we are finding that that's not always the case. We are in internal sort of conflict and dialogue with other organizations who should be allied with us, but are wary of our messaging, who do not want to defund the police, even though it's very clear what we're talking about. I think it's easy to fall into the trap of right-wing politics. There's a narrative that has been created and people are susceptible to it. So we have to remain cognizant of that. In terms of unity, we have to find unity amongst people who share our common values, people who realize that this is not a movement that is just about one singular incident of police brutality, that this is a movement that is about acknowledging the 400 years of systemic oppression that Black Americans have faced in the United States of America. So it has to be about that. It has to be about justice. It has to be about reparations. It has to be about all of these things. And so I'm at a point where if you're not with us, you're not with us. But if you are, and we may have differences of opinion on specific issues, I think that's okay. And there's always room for healthy debate. But it's very, very important that we remain focused on the narrative that we're trying to further here, that we continue to keep people's gaze, that we continue to capture folks' attention and move forward in a way that we can prioritize unity. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, you did more than wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
I have a question. This is gonna be our last question before we move on. But what's it like being someone who's Black but also queer? And how does that inform your experience as an organizer?
Great question. It is difficult. I am sort of thinking right now because I don't get asked this question very often. I would say that it's a strange dynamic sometimes because, of course, there are times where I feel like I'm not truly accepted within the Black community as a bisexual man, and there are times where I do not feel like I am accepted fully within the LGBTQ+ community. There are folks that engage in sort of this oppression Olympics, like LGBTQ+ issues are more important than Black issues or vice versa, when all of these things intersect with one another. And there are people like me who have to deal with both of these issues at the same time. So there's no either or, it's both all the time. So it's difficult. And I think there are a lot of people who are well-intentioned but don't realize that dynamic is very real and it exists for a lot of us. I would say in terms of organizing, there's never a time where I feel like I'm betraying one side of my identity because, again, I try to approach all of this work with an intersectional lens, acknowledging that we're in Pride Month and some of the trailblazers, a vast majority of the trailblazers in the LGBTQ+ rights movement were Black and brown people, who were Black trans women, who were Marsha P. Johnson. I mean, there are so many instances where I can look back in history and see that with all of these movements, we've had people with intersecting identities, and those identities have been erased because they would rather us fit into one box. They would rather tell us who we were, to quote that quote that I spoke about earlier. But it's not that simple this time. I think our generation cares a lot more about intersectionality, is not willing to just treat it like a buzzword, but to really live it in practice and acknowledging that there are so many different identities. There are so many instances of gender, class, sexual orientation, creed, blending into one another and disproportionately affecting people. And that's so important. That's something that our parents didn't have. That's something that our grandparents didn't have. Intersectionality is a concept that has always been around, but was really only named 10, 20, 30 years ago. So this is still a relatively new concept for people. And I would like to think that the young people are really leading the movement when it comes, yet another movement, when it comes to acknowledging that these identities intersect, and we have to be fighting for everyone, because I don't want to leave anyone to fight alone. I don't want to marginalize any group. We saw that when we say Black Lives Matter, of course, we mean all Black Lives Matter. And just a couple of days ago, we have to be very mindful of all of these things. Just a couple of days ago, a member of the disabled community reached out to me and said, Jordan, I am so appreciative of everything that you're doing, but a lot of the events that you organize are not accessible. They're not ADA accessible. They're not accessible to the people who are deaf or hard of hearing or are in a wheelchair and they want to show up to your rallies. And so we've worked with that person, and not only am I making sure that all of my staff are going to a virtual accessibility protest training, but we're also paying that person because it's important to do so for their labor. So there are so many opportunities for us to grow as individuals, to acknowledge that even within these movements that are about marginalization, sometimes people are marginalized, and we have to be fighting for everyone.
Thank you so much again, Jordan. You really hit home with that. So now we're gonna get started with our presentation that we have for you guys today. And again, we want this to be as interactive as possible. So when we go through this, if you guys have any questions or if you guys want to talk about your experiences, because, you know, I, as someone who is both Black and gay, I can't speak for someone who's trans. I can't speak for someone who is non-binary. So if you want to talk about your experiences, please feel free to. And I encourage you to. Or if you have anything you want to add, or any of your work that you want to talk about. So we're gonna get moving.
Okay, so
Oh yeah, you know.
sorry.
We see you.
All right. So Pride. So we're gonna start off with talking about the acronym LGBTQIAP+. So that is an acronym for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, aromantic, pansexual, and the plus is for any other specification one may identify as. Pride Month has occurred every year since 1999. Bill Clinton was the first to declare the month of June Pride Month in 1999. And under the President Barack Obama administration, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage in June of 2015. Pride Month is celebrated in the month of June, mostly to recognize the 1969 Stonewall riots. But like, what are the Stonewall riots, right? So obviously it occurs in the United States to commemorate the Stonewall riots, but the Stonewall riots, also referred to as the Stonewall Uprising or the Stonewall Rebellion, was a series of spontaneous demonstrations by members of the gay or LGBTQ+ community in response to the injustices happening within their community. In response to police raid that began in the early morning hours of June 28th, 1969 at the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village. Next slide, please. Can you go back? Yeah, thank you. So Black historical figures to know are Richard Bruce Nugent, Bayard Rustin, Alvin Ailey, Audre Lorde, Barbara Jordan, Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera. Next slide. So Richard Bruce Nugent, born in 1906 and died in 1987. He is a LGBTQ plus Black history icon, I like to say. So many of the writers of the 1920s Harlem Renaissance at this time were rumored to be gay or identified with the LGBTQ plus community. But Richard was the only one to live an open life. He was a painter, a writer. Nugent's short story Smoke, Lilies, and Jade of 1926 was the first publication to feature open descriptions of homosexuality by an African American. It was written in stream of consciousness, prose, and vogue by contemporary modernists James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. When it was published, critic Benjamin Brawley singled out Nugent's story as an example of Black writers' preference for sordid, unpleasant, or forbidden themes. From 1926 to 1928, Nugent lived with fellow Harlem Renaissance writer Wallace Thurman in an apartment decorated by Nugent with homoerotic murals. In 2004, film Brother to Brother, directed by Rodney Evans, brought Nugent's life to screen, winning awards at Sundance and gay and lesbian film festivals in Miami, New York, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. Next slide. Bayard Rustin, born in 1912 and died in 1987. Rustin was an LGBTQ and civil rights activist, best known for being a key advisor to Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Rustin promoted nonviolent resistance and organized the 1963 March on Washington. In 2013, Rustin was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, for his tireless work promoting equal rights. Alvin Ailey. So for those of you who don't know this, there's an Alvin Ailey Dance Academy in New York. And personally, I didn't know this fact, but when I was looking up activists for the Black community and the LGBTQ plus community, I came across him. And I thought he was really inspirational. My cousin actually attends his school in New York, so I thought it was like really cool, and thought he should really be mentioned because you don't hear a lot about him very often. So Ailey was a choreographer who founded the Alvin Ailey American Dance Theater. His signature work included Cry and Revelations, and they continue to be performed all over the world. In 2014, Ailey was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom for his influential work in bringing dance to underserved communities. Audre Lorde. Lorde is a self-described Black lesbian mother, warrior, and poet. She broke ground with her emphasis on the intersections of race, gender, class, and sexual identity. Her most well-known work includes Sister Outsider, a collection of her essays and speeches, and the semi-autobiography, Zammy, A New Spelling of My Name. Barbara Jordan. She was a civil rights leader and attorney. Barbara Jordan is a political trailblazer. In 1966, she became the first African-American elected to the Texas Senate. And then just a few years later, she became the first woman and first African-American elected to Congress from Texas. In 1992, the NAACP awarded Jordan the Spingarn Medal, and in 1994, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by Bill Clinton. While Jordan never explicitly acknowledged her sexual orientation in public, she was open about her life partner of nearly 30 years, Nancy Earl. Marsha P. Johnson. Johnson was an outspoken transgender rights activist, and she is reported to be one of the central figures of the historical Stonewall riots of 1969. Along with fellow trans activist Sylvia Rivera, Johnson helped form Street Transgender Action Revolutionary STAR in the Star House to help young trans women and drag queens. Johnson is the subject of the Johnson is also the subject of the new Netflix documentary, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, which I highly recommend to all you guys to go watch because it was really good. Sylvia Rivera, as I just mentioned before, Sylvia Rivera was a Latina American gay liberation and transgender rights activist, prominent as an activist and community worker in New York. Rivera, who identified as a drag queen, participated in demonstrations with the Gay Liberation Front. And last but not least, Andrea Jenkins. She made history in November of 2017 by becoming the first openly transgender Black woman elected to public office in the United States. According to the LGBTQ advocacy groups and researchers, Jenkins, a Democrat, was one of 2 openly trans people to win a seat on the Minneapolis City Council last year. The 56-year-old is also a published poet and an oral historian at the University of Minnesota. So due to lack of time, there is nothing on this slide. But I think what I'm going to do for this slide, I'm going to read a quote from the National Black Justice Coalition, and I'm going to talk about what Black History Month pretty much means to me. So the quote is, as long as there have been Black people, there have been Black LGBTQ and same gender loving people. David J. Johnson, executive director of the National Black Justice Coalition, told NBC News. He also said racism combined with the forces of stigma, phobia, discrimination, and bias associated with gender and sexuality have too often erased the contributions of members of our community.
And I think that, yeah, Coach Jamal.
So actually, before I begin this, I want to bring attention to how when I was looking up activists for the LGBTQ plus community in the Black community, I saw like a lot of men. So I had to like dig deeper and I had to research harder to find women who were on the front lines, who were activists and catalysts for change. And I want to bring attention to that because I think a lot of the time, women, especially Black women, are often left out of the conversation when it comes to these things. When a lot of the times they are on the front lines, they are doing a lot of the work and everything like that. So as I was going through this, I think it's really important that we pay attention to these things and how we need to uplift our Black women, our Black trans women, just like the Black community in general. But a lot of the times, as I was saying before, Black women are left out of the conversation, even though they are in the front lines. And I think we need to make a more conscious effort when we do see this to speak up about this and act on making sure that their voices aren't suppressed. Yeah. So. But continue what you're saying, Julian.
So I think one of the main reasons why we wanted to have this presentation was to show you that, these movements, the LGBT movement and the Black Lives Matter movement, have been intersected and intertwined for so long. Often, the LGBT community is dominated by white voices, and we forget about all of the, people of color that were involved in the movement, all the LGBT voices, and we have to look at this from an intersectional approach, right? So, intersectionality, defined by Kimberly Crenshaw, and she defined this as, although racism and sexism intersect, they seldom in feminist and anti-racist practices. And a lot of the time we forget that people, have different identities, and that a lot of the time these same issues intersect. And it's this idea that we all face oppression, and due to that, we all should be fighting for each other. There's too many instances where I hear that there's racism in the LGBT community, or homophobia or transphobia in the Black community, and that's a problem to me because we all face the same discrimination. So why are we subjecting the same people to that same discrimination? It doesn't make sense to me. So I think that as youth, we have to fight and recognize that people of color have different identities and that these identities intersect. So next I want us to talk about the trans community, because a lot of the time the trans community and their experiences are invalidated in the Black community. They go through an extra layer of discrimination, not only for being trans, but for being Black or Latino or a person of color. And that's an extra layer of discrimination that they have to fight against. And we need to make sure that we include trans people in the conversation, because they're oftentimes labeled as mentally ill, or they're continually murdered. We need to recognize people like Remy Fells, people like Tony McDay, Dominique, who have been murdered for being transgender, and who are Black as well, and that they go through a different experience than we go through. We need to recognize that there's discrimination by the administration. When we look at the Title X lawsuit that came out in May, when we look at the transgender ban in the military, these affect people of color as well. And framing this as just an LGBT issue defeats the purpose, and it minimizes the effect that this has on people. Mateo?
Oh, I think this is Jamil Shanti's slide.
Jamal?
Sorry, 1 moment.
So while she figures it out, just to summarize real quick, the Black Lives Matter movement is so important, and we need to remember that queer voices are in this movement as well. We need to recognize that.
Okay. Sorry, it took me a while to find the slide, but so the Black Lives Matter organization is an organized movement. Well, Black Lives Matter as a whole is an organized movement advocating for nonviolent civil disobedience and protests against incidents of police brutality against African American people, people of color, Black people, Black and brown communities. I also, in this slide, I also want to touch on how I feel as though we cannot look at the riots and the protests separately. I think they're all connected, because we protest because we want a better community. We want equal rights. We want civil rights. We want human rights. We want all these things so we can live in a world that promotes equality and it promotes justice. One where we're all free, we're all equal. And I've heard a lot of the time, especially in this time right now, like people saying that we shouldn't be rioting and we shouldn't be, or actually, sorry. I think a lot of time in the Black community, people expect Black people to get over things really quickly. And now we've reached a point where the death tolls, the injustices, the inequality, the discrimination is so high and is so prominent, that it can't even be, we can't ignore it anymore. And as Jordan was saying earlier, we are the generation that have seen the Trayvon Martin story, the Sandra Bland story, and the most recent stories as well. And for me, I'm personally sick and tired of seeing Black faces and Black bodies on the news. I'm tired of us being killed. And these riots and these protests, no, they're not irrational. We're doing this for a reason, because we've already peacefully protested. We've already asked for justice. We've already tried to pass legislation just for equal rights and for human rights and for civil rights. But none of that seems to be working. And so now we've reached a point where we've already been peaceful protesting for years. So now it gets to a point where we know, now we're rioting. Now we're demanding equal rights. We're demanding civil rights. We're demanding human rights. And I think I really just wanted to bring that to you guys' attention, today about how we as a nation, like, we just need to do better. And riots and protests don't just happen for no reason whatsoever. They happen because there's an issue. They happen because there's a problem. And I'm glad that at this point and at this time right now, us as youth are coming together, and not only are we realizing that there's a problem, there's an issue, and we have to do something about it, but because of us, because of our uproar, our parents are seeing this as well. And, you know, hopefully they'll act on it too. And we can inspire our friends and family members to act on this too, and influence them to be better and do better. So yeah, that's just all I have to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, protests and riots, they act as a catalyst for change. Previously in this presentation, we talked about Stonewall, that acted as a catalyst for change. And I really want to highlight marches, legislation, and political figures who have, continued this conversation for today. Then I will also do the same for the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically highlighting legislation and the productivity from the recent protests. So first, as we know, the Stonewall Uprising started in 1969. For the following year, in 1970, the Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day March became the first Pride March in history. While Stonewall was a flashpoint for the LGBTQ plus community, it was at Christopher Street Gay Liberation Day, held exactly 1 year later, that the notion of pride parades was born. Then 4 years later, you have in 1974, there was the first of its kind. A measure was introduced in the New York City Council banning discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation. However, not immediately adopted. In 1986, it was by a vote of 21-14 with very strenuous opposition. Then 3 years later, 1977, Harvey Milk becomes the first openly gay man elected to public office in the United States. He was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Milk became a symbol of the gay community's growing political might. In 1979, the March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights became it brought in an estimated 200,000 people to the nation's capital. It was the largest gathering of the LGBTQ plus community at the time, and it shifted the fight for equality from the local to the national level. Then in 1980, you have the Democratic Party acting as the first major American political party to endorse LGBTQ plus rights as a platform. Then in 1987, 7 years later, in the National March on Washington for Lesbian and Gay Rights, it really was to address the AIDS crisis, discrimination, and the rights of same-sex couples, and that brought in an estimated 300,000 to 500,000 attendees, which dwarfed the 1979 March, and its goals were, of course, bolder. Then that brings in 1993 with, again, another march, and it draws in over 1 million participants. With that, obviously, protests lead to change. Protests act as catalysts for change. In 2000, Vermont becomes the first state to recognize civil unions between same-sex partners, and Hawaii and California had previously given same-sex couples some legal recognition, but Vermont was now the first state to grant them the same rights and responsibilities as marriage. Then in 2010, President Obama officially repeals Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing gay, bisexual, and lesbian service members to serve in the military or armed forces. And then in May 2012, Barack Obama endorses same-sex marriage, which he didn't going into the presidency. But under his administration, in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage. Meanwhile, most recently, the Supreme Court rules LGBTQ plus Americans are protected under federal workplace protection laws in a groundbreaking decision on June 15th, 2020, just 15 days ago, or 14 days ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the prohibition against same-sex discrimination laid out in Title 6 of the 1964 Supreme Rights Act, it applied to LGBTQ plus Americans as well. Okay, so from that, we know that protests, uprising, and icons are active in pushing legislation and court decisions to get closer and closer to equality. This is very similar with the Black civil rights because I'm sure, as we all know, the recent protests, they have really acted as a catalyst for change for the Black community. And could we just go to the next slide? Just the next slide. There we go. So in the last 2 weeks, American voters support the Black Lives Matter movement. It increased almost as much as it had in the preceding 2 years. A Monmouth University poll found that 76% of Americans considered racism and discrimination a big problem, up 26 points from 2015, the inception of the Black Lives Matter movement. And in 19 countries, all 50 states for the first time ever, protests had been organized. Conversations that are only productive are starting to happen. And I think we've all seen in Rhode Island, the governor is pushing efforts to change its name from Rhode Island and Providence Plantations to, I think, just Rhode Island. So that was something interesting that I don't think many people knew about. In Mississippi, the House and Senate and predicted governor are going to pass are going to put into law to actually remove the Confederate flag, which is on their state flag. So that's another momentous, happening that has started because of these protests. We're like finally having these conversations. I think we can refer to Breonna Taylor's case. It's been reopened. The officer has been fired, and although none of them have been arrested yet, which is crazy, Breonna's law was passed in her home city of Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, and then a Republican senator introduced that similar bill at the national level. In George Floyd's case, Minneapolis is set to ban chokeholds by the use of police, and 9 Minneapolis city council members have announced plans to disband the city's police department. And all of the officers complicit in this murder, they were all arrested as well. In Ahmaud Arbery's case, his killers were arrested as well. In Elijah McClain's case, the governor has directed to reopen from a petition that had millions of your signatures. And throughout all of this, what I'm telling you all is that these protests, they are so important. Like, actual change is happening right now. And although it's not to the amount we want it to be, protest, riot, uprisings, they all work. And then that just leads us into our next slide of how to uplift each community.
All right. So first off, I want to do a little correction for something that was said earlier. Harvey Milk isn't the first openly gay elected official in the U.S., but he is the first in the state of California. So I just wanted to correct that.
Okay, sorry for that.
Yeah, sorry. Okay, so for uplifting our communities and being a good ally, I kind of asked some of the members from the LGBTQ plus caucus what they thought and compiled a short list. It doesn't include everything, but these are some key points. First one, kind of obvious, don't out people. So this isn't just like explicitly revealing that somebody identifies as gay or trans or something else within the community, but also it includes other things like first of all, blackmailing, that's something that happens, and also not pressuring people into coming out, and pressuring people like into positions where they have to reveal their identities in order to defend themselves. The second one, using inclusive language. So this would be not using phrases that are cisnormative or heteronormative, so not assuming like that straight or cisgender is the norm, and also using non-gendered terms. Avoiding generalizations or stereotypes. This one just has to do with the fact that not everyone who is LGBTQ fits a box. And there are so many different people, different ways to be gay, different ways to be trans, and there's no right way to be gay or trans. So yeah, everyone is unique, and it's just recognition of that. listening to LGBTQ voices is so not like overpowering LGBTQ voices and listening to people talk about their experiences and valuing their experiences. Okay, learning from your mistakes has to do, so one example would be if you misgender someone, don't make a big deal of it, just correct yourself and apologize and move on. And also, it's okay to be wrong, and it's okay to admit that you were wrong and to correct yourself and to move on. There's no need to be defensive. It's better that you just learn and grow from that experience. Okay, don't minimize LGBTQ experiences. So this one, I think it applies to any marginalized community in that we don't want to compare experiences and try to determine, like, I guess, who has it worse, because every marginalized community goes through something unique. And don't assume that people are cishet. This one is particularly important for this community because it's not something that is always outwardly obvious. And because of things like cancel culture, it can be harmful to assume someone is cishet. If, for example, you think that somebody who is cisgender is speaking for the trans community, when in reality they're not. So it's just important to be aware that not everyone is out. And everything that we mentioned and more things can be found on the HSDA LGBTQ Instagram, so please go check out that graphic that we posted. I think it's Mateo now.
Okay. And then also we wanted to highlight how to uplift the Black community right in this moment. And I first want to start out, continue the current conversations we're having. The first thing I'm going to say, it's minimum, but please continue to repost material regarding the Black Lives Matter movement. Make sure to keep it in people's mind, in people's feed, on the news. The worst thing we can do right now to make this pressing issue that is currently pushing legislation, politicians, organizations, literally everyone to make change. But if we stop, if we ignore the urgency and we will become more resistant to discussing or introducing these new ideas of reform or fundamental structural change. So making sure we continue the conversation of Black Lives Matter and making sure we keep it pressing, making sure we're all at least trying to get on the same page of at least change needs to happen. That's so important, especially for right now. Meanwhile, deject, reject, and suppress. Confront. This is about confronting racism. Confront not just the overt racism, but also the covert racism, which can be more damaging given it's often unchecked, undetected, and it presents itself as normalized or everyday behavior. This is so essential in your family. Meanwhile, you have to know your biases, which we'll talk later in this presentation. We all have unconscious biases, and they are learned stereotypes that are automatic, unintentional, and ingrained in our beliefs. But we have the ability to change that. We have the ability to change our behavior. And then this is probably the most important thing, is look ahead and follow through. Ask yourself, what can you do to continue this movement in 1 month, in 3 months, or 6 months' time? Instead of making a one-off donation, perhaps you set up a smaller monthly payment plan. If you signed a petition, follow up and see how it's progressing. If you've emailed your local politician or even school board, chase them up on it if they haven't responded back. Whatever action you are taking or commitments you are making, it is so important to follow through, because I know so many of y'all are phone banking, sending emails, reposting. So following through and making sure the change you want happens is so important.
Cool. So just to finish up our presentation,
Sorry.
you could want to add something, Jamel, real quick?
Yeah, I was also going to say, like, make sure you guys have conversations. Make sure you guys talk about these issues. Just because it's uncomfortable doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about it. Like, for some of you guys who do not know, like a month ago, like, there's like a Zoom bomber, and they hopped on a call and like screamed the N-word, and people said, oh wow, that's bad, and then like went on with their days. Like, no, make sure you take the time to stop, acknowledge what happened, but then have a conversation about what happened. Because that is what makes a difference. That's different between being silent and being active, and being active in that continuous initiative to become better and make your communities better as well, to have the conversation. So yeah.
Yeah, so these are some key legislations that are being passed for Black and LGBT issues, and we're gonna link the presentation for you guys so that you guys can, read it through and read some bills that you should support or that you should fight against. So these are some just some biases that you guys have and that we have as people. And one thing that I do recommend you guys doing is take the implicit bias association test. I believe it's on the Harvard website. But that in itself really opened my eyes because, like, even for me as a Black person, I had my implicit biases, and we all have them cognitively in the back of our minds. And being able to, in our minds, say to ourselves, maybe I should look at this a different way, or maybe I shouldn't judge this person before meeting this person. And being aware of our implicit biases is so important. And last but not least, I wanted to talk about representation and how in the media we need to see more people of color who are like LGBT. Too often I see so many people who are white playing LGBT roles, and we have to realize that doesn't represent all of our experiences. And one thing that I found especially problematic is in LGBT stories not including race. I watched Love Victor, and I loved it. But one problem that I saw with it was that it didn't really confront racism. They talked about his experience coming out, but, they didn't really intersect that with him dealing with race. And I found that to be a bit problematic because, how can you talk about being in the LGBT community without incorporating racism? And we need to start realizing that these lenses are blended together and that these experiences blend. And movies like Moonlight and Pose do a really great job of that. So I please recommend you guys to watch these films because they're really, really great and inspiring.
Moonlight's on Netflix, by the way.
Yes, it is.
All right. I guess for the resources, I just want to say that there is a hotline for LGBTQ youth by the Trevor Project, and they also have texting. So there's the number right there. And if you go to the website, I think you can also text them. And then we also have some organizations that you can donate to. And what I found interesting is, okay, there are several Black LGBTQ plus organizations out there that you guys could definitely support. And it really emphasizes what we're saying about intersectionality.
Yeah, so I just linked the presentation in the group chat. In the chat if you guys want to take a look at it. I know I'm keeping you guys for so long, I'm sorry. But I hope you guys enjoyed this and you guys learned something. I really wanted this to be a place where we could talk about both these identities together because so many people, like myself included, are Black and queer and have that experience and don't feel like they're being heard or voiced. So thank you guys again for joining us today. Hope you guys go to the group training that's next. I believe that Miles said it in the Discord chat. So hope you guys have a nice day and I hope you guys enjoyed the panel. Thank you for coming.
And if you guys have
And
any questions, feel free to contact us.
Yes, please.
Yes, and thank you, Jordan.
And if you want to join the caucus, you know where to find.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Also,
much.
thank you, Darby, for captioning.
Thank you.
Oh, you don't have access to the slides? Okay, I'm going to turn link sharing on, Gabriel. My bad.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm going to stop recording.